All right, in our first half hour, we looked at what lawmakers in Iowa were up to this past week, and now we're going to the Illinois side. Every Monday, we look at what lawmakers are up to, and helping us with all things Springfield politics is Ben Szalinksi, State House reporter for Capital News Illinois. Ben, thank you for joining us once again. Let's start with the end of the Michael Madigan corruption trial. It went on for weeks. A guilty verdict was handed down last week. What's happening here?
Yeah, the longtime Speaker of the Illinois House, Mike Madigan, is now a convicted felon. He was convicted on 10 counts, mostly related to bribery in his role with ComEd, the main energy provider in northern Illinois. So now he's facing some pretty significant jail time following this trial where he was convicted of various charges on bribery, that he had this illegal relationship with ComEd where he accepted bribes essentially for his support on legislation, as well as to help other members of his team, his allies, his close circle, win new jobs with ComEd.
All right, so turning to our current lawmakers, Governor J.B. Pritzker is expected to deliver his annual budget address on Wednesday. What can we expect?
Yeah, it's going to be a big challenge for the governor. He faces a $3.2 billion deficit, which is one of the largest deficits that he's had forecasted going into a budget year. It's not unusual for the state to face a deficit going into a budget year. These are just projections that the governor's office makes every year. But the big challenge here is the size of this deficit. And it's not easy to fill $3 billion worth of a spending gap. So there's going to have to be some sort of happy medium between either new revenue or spending cuts. The governor has largely ruled out any sort of tax increases. So it's going to be really interesting to see exactly where he decides to fill this gap, if there's going to be any sort of reductions in certain areas of spending that is ultimately going to allow lawmakers to pass a balanced budget.
Ben, I have to ask you, well, we've got all these federal funding freezes kind of looming. How does this play into the governor's budget?
Yeah, that's the other big wild card here. Essentially, federal funding makes up such a big portion of the state's budget every year. And if, for example, which President Trump proposed a few weeks ago, freezing all of that funding, if that were to happen, that could cost upwards of 15% of the state's annual operating budget. So that's a massive gap that the state just can't make up by itself. It would result in massive tax increases, more than likely, if the state was going to continue to provide those services that the federal government was paying for. So that's the huge wild card going into this, is lawmakers have no idea really what the Trump administration is going to decide to do and how reliable federal funding is going to be in the coming months and throughout the entire fiscal year.
Sticking with the budget, I also wanted to ask you, a huge portion of Illinois' budget is all about education. What's that looking like ahead of Wednesday?
Yeah, the State Board of Education has asked for an annual funding increase. And education is one of those really tricky areas for state lawmakers, especially when they face a deficit like this, because for one, it's politically not a good idea to cut education spending. It's something that lawmakers all agree is good for the state. But it's also got some legally required spending, such as $350 million more that lawmakers have to give to K-12 schools every year. So there's a lot of areas there that lawmakers have both as a priority and as a legal priority. And when they need to address those areas, which means other areas of the budget could potentially be affected in order to keep up this education spending.
Well, before I let you go, Ben, Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul announced that Illinois has joined another multi-state lawsuit against the Trump administration. This was last week. It's about the president's decision to slash research funding, but it's the fourth lawsuit Raoul has joined in the last month. What is all of this costing Illinois?
Yeah, we're not exactly sure what the actual dollar figure is at the moment, but we do know that this is costing the Attorney General a lot as far as manpower and taking resources away from other cases. So the big challenge the Attorney General has said is that this is putting a big strain on his office. There's a lot more time spent on these cases, and he essentially needs more staff to handle all these lawsuits that are coming in, as well as the lawsuit that the Trump administration filed against the state of Illinois over immigration. So what the Attorney General has said is he's not exactly ready to ask state lawmakers for more funding, because he recognizes that we do have budget challenges this year, and there's other areas of the budget that are going to be priorities for lawmakers to continue spending on. But he said he plans to go to lawmakers and appropriations hearings this spring and talk to them about the impact filing all these challenges the Trump administration is having on his office, so they can kind of get an idea that his office does need more financial resources, because this is starting to become a very costly first month of the Trump administration for the Illinois Attorney General.
Yeah, well said. Ben, thank you so much for keeping us up to date on all things Springfield politics.
Thanks, Shelby.
Of course, you guys at home can keep up with all of our Illinois and Iowa politics coverage by going to WQAD.com. The latest articles can be found underneath the As Seen on TV tab.